Well, the US President Barack Obama has called a special summit next week of the world's major economies, including Australia, to try to break the deadlock in international negotiations over climate change. The presidential move comes after the lower house of Congress passed a bill over the weekend limiting greenhouse emissions in the United States. But President Obama wants to reverse provisions in the bill which impose trade penalties on countries which fail to set greenhouse gas limits. As we mentioned, Mr Obama believes the move is too protectionist. His anti-protectionist signal could help him build international consensus for carbon emissions cuts in the lead up to a UN conference in Copenhagen in December. The Denmark conference will aim to produce a successor to the 1997 Kyoto Treaty on climate change, this time with the United States and Australia on board. Margot O'Neill reports.
The fast-rolling numbers on a new electronic billboard in New York measure greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, a stark reminder that the clock is ticking to combat climate change. But it contrasts with the lack of movement in international negotiations.
Effectively what we've got is the developed world and the developing world lining up to play chicken on the issue of low carbon development plans and developing country commitments.
The key players are also the world's two biggest polluters, the United States and China. Together, they're responsible for more than 40% of the world's carbon emissions.
You're not going to get an effective deal in Copenhagen without the US and China engaging effectively together.
The bill is passed.
US President Barack Obama strengthened his nation's negotiating credibility on Friday by helping to push a landmark bill to curb emissions through the lower house of Congress. The bill still faces a battle in the Senate, but it's the first major action by the US to address climate change.
There's no longer a debate about whether carbon pollution is placing our planet in jeopardy. It's happening. And there's no longer a question about whether the jobs and industries of the 21st century will be centered around clean, renewable energy.
But tonight, President Obama was asking Congress to strip out a clause imposing trade sanctions on countries that don't adopt carbon pollution reduction schemes by 2020, a clause likely to draw major protests from developing countries, especially China and India. Right now, the road to Copenhagen is more of a roadblock. There are fundamental disagreements between rich and poor countries about how much the developed world should cut their emissions, about whether developing countries should have any targets at all, and about how much money should flow to poor countries to help them deal with climate change.
Mr. Speaker.
Last week, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown tried to break the stalemate over financial aid by declaring that major economies should deliver $125 billion a year. But developing countries like China have been arguing for up to $250 billion a year. They also warn they'll make no commitments to reduce their carbon emissions unless the industrialised world agrees to cuts of at least 40% by 2020. So what is the state of play halfway to Copenhagen? The key players among developed countries are the European Union, Japan and the United States. Using 1990 as a baseline, Europe says it will cut emissions by 20 to 30% by 2020. Japan has made an initial offer of an 8% cut. The United States Congress is debating a bill that could mean a cut of up to 18%. And Australia has offered about 4%, but could go up to 24%. What's worrying observers is that these commitments don't come close to averting a global temperature increase of 2 degrees or more, which many scientists say is the tipping point for dangerous climate change.
The targets that are on the table from developed countries equate to about 15% below 1990s. And the consensus to what we need to prevent warming above 2 degrees is between 25 and 40%, and really at least above 30% if we're going to be honest about it. So we're around half the way there, and we've only got about 6 months left.
But there's also disagreements about whether the world should aim to limit global warming to 2 degrees. Europe says it must. Australia agrees, but the US and India are actively blocking this target. The key developing nations are China, Brazil, South Africa and India. They argue, with understandable force, that the developed world enjoyed all the economic benefits while creating the greenhouse gas problem in the first place, as pointed out by the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri.
The United States of America consumes twice as much coal as India for a population of 300 million. If you look at the number of coal-fired power plants they have on the drawing board, they will exceed any number that you come up with for India. So, why is it that we don't focus on that part of the world? Why are we singling out India and China? Why doesn't the United States do away with coal-fired power stations?
Industrialised countries are worried about giving economic advantage to China and India. And they say with equal force that even with dramatic action by the developed world, China's ballooning emissions alone could still tip the world over 2 degrees. Of course, the atmosphere doesn't care who started what or when. So what is the chance of getting an agreement which will address global warming?
There's almost no chance we're going to get an agreement that's going to put us on course for keeping temperatures below 2 degrees.
President Obama has called a special summit of the leaders of the world's major economies for next week to try to break the deadlock. Margot O'Neill, Lateline.